This is Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University. I'm your host, Alan Mendenhall, Executive Director of the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy and Associate Dean of the Sorrell College of Business. My guest today is Scott Shepard of the National Center for Public Policy Research in Washington, D.C. He directs the Free Enterprise Project. Scott, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Alan. It's great to be here with you.
Well, I just want to start by asking you a little bit about the Free Enterprise Project and what you're focusing on and what you do at NCPP.
Well, sure. What we get up to in the Free Enterprise Project for about 15 years, my predecessor and then I have been for a long time the lone voice in the conservative woods, telling our colleagues that we just can't rely on corporate executives and C-suites to have the back of a conservative or Republican or libertarian interests, or even to look out for the bottom lines of their companies, that they've been pressured by an organization and a coalition of organizations on the left, by liberal politicians threatened with legislation, threatened with regulation. And so corporations have moved very far in the social and environmental and other streams to the left as political actors, and that we needed to fight back about that and fight back against that. And we've done that with shareholder activism, shareholder proposals to corporations and other vehicles. We've gotten into filing lawsuits against corporations, against the Securities and Exchange Commission and other players in this racket, and working on state legislative reform and regulatory reform to try to fight back against the left wing, the woke takeover of American corporations.
For a long time, American corporations and executives were considered heroes for many people on the political right. You think of sort of the heroes of Randian novels.
That's right.
And they're all CEOs who are go-getters. But the culture of corporate America has changed. Tell us a little bit about why that has taken place and what's occurred so that the landscape of corporate America is somewhat different from the way it was, let's say, during the Reagan years of the 1980s.
Yep. Well, even you mentioned Rand, even back as she was styling Atlas Shrugged, there were a lot more Jim Taggarts than there were Hank Reardons. And that was true in the 60s, when a lot of the corporate executives ended up in the Kennedy administration because they were corporatists who were looking for a coordination between business and government, largely at the expense of both consumers, employees, and certainly capitalists, certainly the shareholders. That declined because of the economic disaster of the 1970s. That declined in the 80s and through the 90s. But what we're seeing today, and what we've been seeing for the last 7 or 8 years, and particularly since the riot and protest summer of 2020, is the emergence of an explicitly hard left control of too many American corporations that have left their fiduciary duties behind, and their ultimate duties, their primary duties to shareholders, who after all are the owners of the company, behind, and instead are doing their personal policy preferences, personal policy preferences of corporate executives or of the investment houses that funnel so much money through ETFs and other vehicles to these corporations. And so we find them taking sides in really irrelevant to their business political issues like election integrity, the Georgia law a couple of years back, abortion in all sorts of different ways, that we find them adopting systems of genuine discrimination in their corporations, discrimination on the basis of race, discrimination on the basis of sex, and on the basis of orientation, all of which are unconstitutional and illegal, but they're undertaking because they've embraced the new theory of equity, which is to say discrimination now on those 3 bases to make up for other discrimination by other people against other people in the past. And according to the equity theory, the developers of equity theory, to continue on that path until you've achieved equality of outcome. Well, equality of outcome, equal ownership of goods and equal power, that's just a fairly hardcore variety of socialism. And we've got CEOs of giant corporations embracing that, not for themselves, of course. They keep their mansions, they keep their private jets, but for all the rest of us. And so it's just an absolute deviation from the understanding, the basic fact of shareholder capitalism, basic facts of shareholder capitalism, and the basic facts of fiduciary duty into a world in which the personal policy preferences of executives determine both the positions of corporations and the way shareholder assets are spent.
There's a lot of talk about ESG in the news today, so environmental, social, and governance metrics. And these are non-financial standards that investors and entities in financial services use to refer to, to the non-financial, pieces of corporations and their goals that don't have to do with maximizing profits for shareholders, which is historically, at least in the United States, the whole purpose of corporations. How much of the movement that you're talking about is attributable to what we're calling ESG?
Well, quite a lot of it, especially if you understand what ESG actually encompasses. The proponents of ESG talk about it as though it's just a phrase they use very often is doing well by doing good, right? Which is to say increasing shareholder value by doing what the proponents of ESG call good, which are always left-wing political goals, as it happens. But they pretend it's not terribly partisan, it's not woke. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, made a strong but fairly empty case a couple of years ago that even though he was pushing equity-based discrimination of the sort I just described, and the other big tenet of ESG, which is setting politically established dates for decarbonizing companies rather than using the energy that makes sense given technological realities, the need for reliability and for affordability, right? To shift early on a political schedule, to claim that that wasn't partisan. But when it comes down to it, what ESG is embracing the left-wing goal of equity-based discrimination and the left-wing goal of decarbonization on a political schedule. There are other details as well, but those are the two big ones. And forcing those policies on companies. Now, those also happen to be the two whole-of-government initiatives of the Biden administration. So the idea that political decarbonization and equity-based discrimination aren't partisan or woke, that doesn't pass the sniff test. But what we have is an ESG movement that pretends to be nonpartisan and just gosh golly doing good, but is a Trojan horse for the leftwardization of corporate focus and of corporate spending.
One of the chief problems with ESG involves fiduciary duties.
Yep.
Talk about what fiduciary duties are and why they're at play in this ESG movement.
Yeah. Well, under capitalism or shareholder capitalism, or what everybody understood to be capitalism until very recently in the United States, and what's still the law, by the way. I mean, this is established. Corporations law establishes these fiduciary duties. Those laws haven't been changed. They still govern corporate and corporate executive responsibility. Under the law, corporations, which are really agglomerations of small bits of individual capital together, so that small property owners can own parts of larger corporations and benefit from having collected and saved their own capital and buying those shares. Corporate executives are the employees of the shareholders, and the boards of directors have an express duty to speak for smaller shareholders and to do the objective will of smaller shareholders rather than to enact their own personal policy preferences. And at at fiduciary law, if this trust is violated, if executives and directors act in their own personal interests rather than in the objective and neutral best interests of shareholders, then they are thought to have conducted self-dealing. That's the term of art in the law. And when they've conducted self-dealing, then they're liable when the smaller shareholders sue, standing in the shoes of the corporation, doing the job that the boards of directors have failed to do. When they stand in the shoes of the corporations and sue those directors and executives, if self-dealing is established, then the directors and executives owe the company for everything that self-dealing potentially lost the company out of their own pockets. So it's a powerful tool that gets results. You can imagine that if these executives start getting sued and losing and having money taken out of their pockets because they've been self-dealing by doing their personal policy preferences rather than what's in the interest of shareholders, they're going to stop very quickly. They don't want to lose personal assets. The problem that we've run up against is that this just shanghaiing of corporate assets for the personal policy preferences of directors is fairly new in the world, in the American corporate world. We haven't seen an insurrection from the C-suites before like this, and so there's a lacuna in the fiduciary duty law and precedent that hasn't been established in precedent yet. That self-dealing, not for pecuniary reasons, not to slip some corporate assets into an executive's pocket, but for policy preference reasons, taking shareholder assets to advance the personal policy preferences of directors and executives. It hasn't been established in precedent yet that that's self-dealing. There's no reason, though, to believe that self-dealing doesn't extend beyond pecuniary behaviors, financial behaviors, into political preference or other personal interest behaviors. And I think once we've had a few cases, lawsuits against corporations, a couple of cases that take some money out of executives and directors' pockets for this sort of self-dealing, then we're going to see quite a bit of the ESG and stakeholder capitalism edifice fall right apart.
A few years ago, the Business Roundtable redefined the purpose of the corporation away from the maximization of profits for shareholders, away from shareholder primacy. That stakeholder model of governance enables CEOs to get away with a lot of things. It gives them wider latitude because they are much easily held accountable when they have to just maximize profits for shareholders, because you can measure profits. That's something that it's just math. You can tell. You just run the math at the end of the year and you determine whether you were profitable or not. But if you've redefined the purpose of the corporation to do good and to champion all sorts of political causes, how do you measure success? How do you determine if it's not profits? How do you determine whether a company's successful? And can CEOs get away? Can they conceal their unprofitable activities or some of their mistakes by a focus on some of these social causes?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. A little background about that: the Business Roundtable is really just a luncheon club for CEOs. They get together and they meet and they share their thoughts, and it has no power at law whatever. It's just CEOs who lunch and have opinions. And one of their opinions in August of 2019 was to announce on their own behalves redefinition of the purpose of a corporation in the United States. Now, keep in mind that these people had no power to do anything at all, and so this declaration doesn't mean anything except in their own to their own egos, perhaps. But they'd said that, as you were suggesting, they said that the purpose of the corporation was no longer shareholder capitalism, which is still their duty at law, but now stakeholder capitalism. And gosh golly, they were going to do everything they could for all of their stakeholders, for employees, for clients, for the environment, for communities. It was described so widely, and considering shareholders only last, that it encompassed absolutely everyone and everything. And they said, well, we're gonna run corporations for the benefits of all stakeholders. Problem with that is that obviously, if we could run anything for the benefit of everybody in any context, we wouldn't have contested elections. We wouldn't have the divided polity that we have in the Republic today. You can't do anything for all stakeholders. And so what ends up happening in the first instance is this becomes a cover for the personal policy preference direction by CEOs, the insurrection of the C-suites I mentioned earlier, because what they do is they pick certain sets of stakeholders who they know already agree with where they want to go, how they want to use shareholder assets to support their personal policy preferences, and then they favor those groups and pick them out and say, well, we're making this move not for us. We're not doing our own personal policy preferences. We're doing it on behalf of stakeholders. Now, of course, there are plenty of stakeholders who disagree and want the exact opposite result, and they just ignore those and make sure that they don't have a voice. But one of the background reasons for not only to do their own personal policy preferences, but you're exactly right that this hides a lot of misfeasance. You know, Mark Benioff at Salesforce, and right now he's got some private equity investors who want to change out his board of directors in recognition of this problem. He is a devoted left-winger. I think that's his conscience position, who's spent a lot of Salesforce money to push left-wing causes. He's also done a lot of share buyback and a lot of equity, a lot of paying himself through equity, and under providing benefits to shareholders and keeping money in the corporation, which has made him a good target to have his board taken over. And you'll recall, I mean, this is slightly out of context, but you may recall, I think it was in 2016 when the Harvey Weinstein, was that his name? The fellow who ended up in jail for misdeeds.
From Hollywood?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, at the beginning of the Me Too movement. Well, the first thing he said after he got caught with this trail of horrific behavior, the first thing he came out and said, I'm going to dedicate a lot of money to anti-gun rights causes, to gun control causes. Well, a lot of that occurs at these corporations as well, when they're not having business success, when they're not fulfilling their fiduciary duties, when they should be stepping aside or are not running their companies correctly. One of the things they can do is embrace a lot of left-wing causes and put out what the Obama administration called stray voltage, to hide from shareholders and others that they're not running their companies very well.
Yeah, for many of these CEOs, I suspect the commitment to these causes is inauthentic in the sense that they can be accused of greenwashing, or fabricating or manipulating data in order to make it appear as though their company is doing well by doing good and all those kinds of things. And they're getting awfully wealthy in the process. They're lining their own pockets, but at the expense of wider society. Pension funds, state pension funds, they're public employees throughout the country who probably are unaware of the ways in which their money is being invested. The public pension money may be invested with BlackRock or State Street or Vanguard or one of these asset management firms, which is putting money into social causes. And so there are public employees throughout the country that may be unaware that their retirement money is supporting causes with which they disagree.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. We've seen in far too many states, and in states where you really wouldn't expect it, retirement funds and other state asset funds that have been left in the hands of BlackRock or State Street or Vanguard. Those are the three big investment houses, or other investment vehicles for teachers' funds. TIACREF is another one Larry Fink at BlackRock can pretend he's not partisan, but they use those assets in order to push corporations in left-wing directions. And so you say these inauthentic CEOs who make stray voltage with commitments to left-wing positions, but also a lot of them who are being forced by the investment houses, by BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard, and being forced using money that come out of pension funds from employees who worked all their lives, had their own personal policy preferences, their own politics, and have no idea that these investment managers, who tend to be, because they're state government employees, tend to be on the left, use explicitly themselves or invest in ways that allow investment house managers to use their assets, their retirement funds, the money that's waiting for them, to advance left-wing causes that many of them would find appalling.
Yeah, there's an important distinction between the activist institutional investors, which are buying massive amounts of shares in publicly traded companies and trying to bully corporate boards of directors to the left, and companies that are trying to maximize their ratings for private ESG ratings agencies and maybe manipulating data or fudging data, because these private ratings agencies have no mechanism for compelling companies to provide more accurate data.
Yep, that's certainly true.
The Alliance Defending Freedom has come out with the Viewpoint Diversity Index, and I know this is a document that you support and that you would like to see more businesses adopting. Can you explain why and what the function of this index is?
Yeah, another one of the methods and mechanisms that have forced corporations to the left are that left-wing organizations have set up indices that they ask corporations to fill out surveys, and then once they get the survey results back, they rank corporations and give them an index number, a score on the index, for how closely the company aligns its activities with the value of the values of the organization giving out the surveys and establishing the index. One of the most successful of these has been HRC's, the Human Rights Campaign's Equality Index. And you might remember HRC some years ago as being an organization that fairly strictly or broadly put itself on the mission of getting gay marriage to be made legal in states and then eventually at the federal level. And whatever you think about that, that was a fairly clear mission. But in getting companies to participate in the index, the survey, and then providing scores and then pushing companies to tout their scores, they got companies to take a political position on something that really didn't have much to do with the bottom line of their companies. And now the HRC has, just as sort of in the last 7 or 8 years, what the left wants has expanded tremendously. So too, what the HRC demands for a good index score has advanced tremendously. And so in order to have a perfect score, your corporation has to fairly aggressively support the destruction of girls and women's sports by allowing people who were born as boys and developed that way to participate in the girls and the women's sports, and really undermine 40 years of progress in allowing women to compete effectively and making that possible, and other positions that are really extreme positions. And so the Viewpoint Diversity Index that ADF has put together, what it's designed to do is be a curative to the problem of all these indexes, corporations changing their behavior, changing their positions, using shareholder access to appease left-wing indexes and get higher scores. Theirs is a Viewpoint Diversity Index, and it's genuinely focused on making sure that companies don't discriminate on the basis of viewpoint in their spending for employees, for clients. We've seen a lot of companies, JP Morgan Chase most recently, debanked Governor, Senator, Ambassador Brownback's organization to protect religious liberty, and then lied about it. And we've been working with them as shareholder activists to try to get them to adopt this index, along with the HRC index. We're not trying to be exclusive about anything. And we learned that their process was to listen to big and important investors and do what those investors want. But they changed the process for this conservative organization, and for this index, they're refusing to meet with big investors in order to get the feedback that under their own rules would require them to adopt the index. So we're seeing a lot of discrimination at a lot of levels, particularly at banks, but also obviously at social media companies, and in ways that really affect the public discourse and the ability to be a free political actor in American society. And so what this index would require of companies is for them to be honest and revealing about, and to think hard about, the ways in which they are discriminatory, and of course would reward companies that are less viewpoint discriminatory. And so we're seeing some adoption of that, and that's, I think, a very positive thing. We're seeing some places like Chase that are changing their own rules in order to keep discriminating just right down to the last. And we found that fairly troublesome, but a fight worth taking on.
Well, ESG is all over the news today and these days. We have 21 Republican attorneys general challenging new Department of Labor rules that would sort of relax investment criteria for 401ks and allow investments in ways that traditionally would have thought of would be breaching fiduciary duties. We had in the last midterm elections people paying attention to state treasurer races in ways that people like before didn't pay attention to state treasurer races in other states. And there's legislation either being passed or considered in states limiting the ways that pension funds can be invested. My last question is, why has ESG only now come to people's attention? I mean, ESG was the topic of a 2003 United Nations Government of Switzerland conference called Who Cares Wins. It's been around for a while, but why is it only now that people are beginning to talk about it?
Well, I think it really goes back to the summer of 2020. We, as I said at the beginning, we've in my organization have been trying to warn conservatives and libertarians about this for many years, what was going on. And nobody paid much attention because there was a background assumption built from the goodwill of the 80s and the 90s that corporations were going to do the right things for shareholders. And there were enough other fires that was one place we didn't have to worry about a fire erupting. And because we weren't worrying, the fire did erupt. You got to give credit to the left. There's a coalition of about 120 organizations, the As You Sow coalition, that have been bothering corporations for 40 years about this stuff and did get a lot of movement left. But what happened, I think, to bring it all to everybody's consciousness was that in the wake of the protests and the riots in the summer of 2020, a lot of companies, and it was during the lockdowns, I think communication was bad. A lot of companies jumped on the discrimination in the name of equity bandwagon, and that's what really woke people up, that it was going on in the schools and that it was an existential problem.
Well, Scott, thank you for enlightening our audience. Thank you for being here. This has been Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business. Thank you for watching.